small group, but hopefully everyone will be still joining us. I'm thrilled that we have Greg Melson with us today, and as I said to you and sent to you as a link, Greg has been a longtime friend to the McNeely Center in advising our students, mentoring students, bringing forth his financial skill set to you to think about his, as Paul Marcic would refer to it, the Melson method of thinking about financials. Greg's St. John's alum, his wife Barb, who I had the opportunity actually with Joe Rogers, like you will be. Barb and I were venturing off to China together 3 or 4 years ago. And I've worked a lot with his wife Barbara and a number of things for St. Ben's. She's a St. Ben's alum. They have 4 children, all of who are St. Ben's and St. John's alums. And in fact, their youngest, Matt, was very involved at the launch of Johnny Jacka. So, and you can certainly see the influence of the Melson method of financial analysis as a core component of whether or not I was going to have a successful launch. Greg began his career as a CPA. He spent many years in the public arena as a public accountant with a very large top 4 firms. We have 2 accounting folks here in front row, so they repeats. And then from then moved on to serving as a chief financial officer in many different entrepreneurial and large scope ventures. And today he's the CFO and chief and vice president of Technic Corporation. He's been on the road a lot, pitching their company, and it's a very fascinating business. You know, I love businesses like Technic, where you just never knew there was a business that did the type of thing that they did in the global scope and the products they introduced. So today, Greg's going to be talking about just his perspectives of how thinking about financial analysis as you're launching your ventures, as well as sharing a little bit of his story. So I'll let you begin.
Thank you. That was a good introduction for background. The one thing Margaret left off is with some buddies, I also started a business. And we ran it for about 7 years, and then we ran into trouble. We were constantly short of cash. We talked a lot about cash today. And we ended up selling the business at the end. So, life's not always a success. There's ups and downs in business and careers. So that's been part of my life as well. But going back, as I was mentoring of the entrepreneurial program, one of the things that I felt pretty strongly about is there needs to be really a good understanding of the markets, who you're selling to, why you're selling to, and how big that market is. Then you've got to have some link between the financial statements and analysis and the business plan. There also needs to be a real focus on cash. And so I think, as I've gone through working with the students, it's been a great deal of creativity, good business plans, but it seems like that market analysis, the time of the financials, and the focus on cash is not there. And that shouldn't be surprising because I face those same issues every day. As Margaret said, I was just on the road for the last 4 weeks. I met with 80 investors in 5 different cities. And the questions that I got were, what are your markets? How big are they? How do you sell? Why do people buy? How much cash are you going to generate? How do the financials tie in? What's my return on investment? And so the same issues that we're going to talk about today are the ones that I face every single day. So it's not unique to entrepreneurial businesses, but it's true really in all businesses. And that's the direction we're going to go today. And certainly interrupt me and ask questions and enter into dialogue. At the end, we've got these slides, so you don't have to copy every word down of every slide for you. But the reality is that somebody owns the business. And unless you're probably Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or somebody, you don't have complete control. But you have investors in it, or you have bankers that loan the money, and they expect a return on their investment. And if it's your money and your time, and maybe that's what the investment is, you expect a return on that investment and time. And there's risk involved, and the higher the risk, the greater the return you expect, because things might not work out. So you expect more return in case it doesn't work out. And that's the reality of life. Everybody's got a boss, and somebody's money is involved, and they want a return on that money. And the way you get the return is you focus on sales. But sales are really important because that drives a whole number of things that we'll talk about. But it's not just sales, it's the profit that you generate from that sales. And it's not just the profit, it's the cash, because cash is what gives you the return to reinvest in the business and give a return to the investors. So there's a natural flow of this, and that's what we'll be talking about today. But the bottom line, I've got at the bottom here, is really you want sales growth because you want to grow in business, but you want earnings to grow faster than sales, and you want cash to grow faster than earnings. And this is then the natural flow of that. Maybe a good summary. So you start with sales, and that leads to your profitability, which leads to your cash, and then ultimately to a return on investment. The thing is, as you walk through your business plans, that's kind of the core. You spend a lot of time writing and analyzing and developing a strong business plan. But you have all these three financial statements, and the accounting people understand this probably better than some of the rest of you do. But they all tie together, because you can't do a cash flow analysis without a good balance sheet, because cash flow really flows from changes in the balance sheet. And you can't do a cash flow analysis without a good operating statement. You can't do a good balance sheet without an operating statement. So they all really tie together. It's kind of like a simultaneous equation, and they've all got a link to the business plan. So as you're writing the business plan, you're constantly going back and forth between all these four elements. And it becomes very much a simultaneous equation. And it never ends. I mean, you're constantly working and reworking, and I would say we never get done. We just, at the company I'm at, did a presentation on our strategy. And I think we went through 25 versions of that before we finally got it to the point where we could unveil it to the public. And I can't tell you the venture that I was in, how many business plans and different models. I mean, it was like every month we had a different one that we were updating and tweaking, because we learned more, understood the markets better, understood the customers better. But again, there's this linkage, and you really have to understand how the linkage happens. So I think there's a lot of focus on the P&L and the operating statement, and I think most of you have a pretty good understanding that you've got sales, you've got cost of your sales, and then you have profits that come from that. But how does the balance sheet interact, and then what happens to the cash flow statement? So that's kind of what the problem is. But there's a logical order I think we can go through that will help you be able to conquer this uncomfortableness. So there's a 12-step guide. This is my version of 12 steps. There's all sorts of 12-step rehab programs, so I've got my 12-step program, and I think if you follow this in order, and then you route back and just keep looping through these 12, then you can come up with a very good business plan, and you can come up with a plan where all these statements tie together. But it starts with analyzing the market. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about sales assumptions, understanding of the market. Because if you can do that, especially 2 and 3, you'll get a good operating statement. I think you can probably all figure out your costs. That's probably maybe one of the easier things to do. And then from that, you can prepare a balance sheet, determine how much money you really need to run the business, how much you need for equipment, how much you need to finance the business, how much you need to run the business. And then you go down to the cash flows that really come from all of that.
Greg, I'm wondering if it might be helpful for them to just kind of quickly introduce themselves so you get a sense of the type of businesses they're working on. So, Emily, do you want to start with just your, just like 10 seconds?
Sure. I'm working on a non-profit model of agriculture in developing nations.
In developing nations?
My name's Josh, and I'm working on a late night grilled sandwich delivery system for St. John's on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays.
My name's Evan, and I'm working on a t-shirt company with Justin and Miles as well.
My name's Josh, and I am working on ag with my family's landscaping and crop management.
My name's Lauren, and I'm working with Johnny here on it's called Joe Lake. It's a social media platform, informational outlet for people with lake homes in the Brainerd to Walker area.
Okay, I know where you're from. You're from that way?
Yeah, I'm from the cities, but I have a lake placeholder.
I'm Justin, and I'm working with Evan and Miles on the apparel company.
I'm Johnny. I'm working with Lauren and Julie.
I'm Miles, and I'm working with Evan and Justin on the apparel company.
I am Ryan Wojciechowski. I'm starting a fitness and health program at St. John's that uses personal trainers and dietitians to create personal training plans.
I'm Andrew, also working on a nonprofit that sends students to Africa to build sustainable businesses.
And I'm Mariana. I'm working on an application for life benefits.
Boy, what a variety of different just ventures. You learn a lot, though, I think, when you talk to different people, because you've all got your own issues, and it's interesting. It'll be interesting to hear what your issues are. So as we go through this, if you have questions on this, you're struggling with part of it, I'd like to know what those are, and I think we can enter into some debate and discussion on that. I think this may be the final thing. I often get asked, how far do you project out? I was working on one deal just recently where somebody's projecting out 20 years. I can't project out the next quarter, next 20 years. It's very difficult to do. But I think you need to go out at least for 3 years in a plan, maybe 5. You start annually, and then I think what you do is you work backward. For the first couple of years, you want to do it quarterly, and then you want to do it by month. And then what you really want is you want a plan that you can measure against in relatively short period of time, like monthly. And you're doing constantly then a rolling projection 3 or 5 years out. Months for like the first year, quarters for the first couple, for the next couple, and then you can do annually. But you're going to be constantly changing them. It's interesting in some of the businesses, the apparel business, you say you're going to do $10,000. Well, are you going to do for $12,000 a year, or whatever the number is? Are you going to do $1,000 a month, or is it going to be nothing, and then it's all dependent on the last month? And if you really want a good plan, you've got to know and have those short-term measurements. So this is what I'd recommend for periods as you go out. Hopefully, this isn't contrary to what you're teaching. The whole key is what are your assumptions behind any number? And we'll talk about market size and sales and how many people and how much equipment, but what are your assumptions? How much does each one of those elements cost? And my proposal is that when you put together a business plan, if you lay out the assumptions, you should then be able to just mathematically model the operating statement of P&L, the balance sheet, cash flow statement without any effort. If you do a good job with the assumptions, defining the assumptions, and that's where I spend all my time. The rest is almost mechanical, and it flows right from the assumptions. So you really need to understand the business. It allows you to go back and forth to test the assumptions, to test the model. And this is where I put the bulk of my time, to really challenge the validity of the assumptions. So I'm going to go through each of these 12 steps in various degree of detail, but we're going to focus probably on the first couple. And the first is to identify the market. And how big is that market? What's the size of the market? And then who is actually going to buy from you? I was talking to Margaret earlier in the business I'm in. I just, as I said, came off the road 4 weeks of talking to people, and they want to know what the market is. And it's like our market is a huge matrix. It's an international matrix. How much is U.S., how much is Europe, how much is Asia, how much is South America, how much is developing countries, how much is mature countries. So you can do it geographically. And then it's by product set. We've got 3 main product sets. So how many proteins do we sell, antibodies, and kits do we sell? So you got a matrix going this way. And then the other is, who's the end user? Is it schools, or is it pharma companies, or who do you sell to? So you've got this matrix. It becomes very, very difficult to identify the market.
I was just wondering, could you please provide us with like a short background of what company, like what you guys actually do?
Yeah. I mean, we're a sizable company. Our value is $3 billion. That's the value. We've got almost 1,000 employees worldwide. And we sell proteins and antibodies that we make in the lab. And they're basically the raw materials that are used in pharmaceutical and biotech research. So if you're any biology majors here? Good, then I'm free to go with whatever I feel like saying. Okay. There are the consumable raw materials that are used by researchers that are at the bench. So researchers trying to identify what causes a cell to grow or to die. I mean, cells either are growing or dying. Cancer is, uncontrolled growth, and sometimes you have cell death, which causes disease. So researchers are trying to conquer disease and develop cures. What they want to do is what causes a cell to grow or to die, what kind of communication happens in a cell, and how the cells communicate with each other. They use our products to test, to run experiments to figure that out. So it's a kind of a weird business. It's highly scientific. It's not necessarily financially complex, but it's scientifically just mind-boggling. I mean, we have 650 people in Twin Cities, 130 more PhDs, literally from around the world. So we've got a whole huge cultural issue that we're visiting on as well. So hopefully that answers the question. But it's really difficult to define the market. We have trouble defining the market because you define very broadly, you define very narrowly, geographically, it's by product type, it's by customer type. And the way we handle it is we look at all of those dimensions in that matrix, and we keep testing it against each other to see if the assumptions are really reasonable and plausible, and does the business plan make sense. So this is really what drives the whole model, and you cannot do enough study, and research, and understanding. That means you have to talk to customers, you've got to read look at competitors, you've got to look at other businesses, you've got to read a lot of literature. You do whatever you can to find out as much as you can about the markets. So I'm going to go through an example on how to identify a market. And I'll make up some examples here, but hopefully it'll help you work through your own, because every one of your models is different. But the first thing is, who is going to buy your product or service? Okay? So, does one of you want to volunteer how you look at this, how you define your market?
Well, we are the late night grill cheese delivery service, and we define the market by students on upper and lower campus, as well as split by their year. So freshmen on upper campus, sophomores on upper campus, juniors and seniors on lower campus.
Okay.
So that's what we just define our market.
Now, are you aware that there was a prior class about 5 years ago that had a similar concept?
Yep. I actually went to high school with the guy.
Okay, because I've got that as an example that we'll walk through. So maybe that'll help you out.
Good.
Anybody else want to try? How do you define your lake home business? Is it everybody in Minnesota? Is it upper Midwest? Is it the Twin Cities? Is it people above a certain income level? How are you defining your market?
Well, right now it's pretty large. We're focusing on the Brainerd Lakes area to Walker. But right now, I think we're trying to decide, what age group we're focusing on, because, people could log on a site and want information about, younger people who just got their voter's license, for example, and they want more information. But then you could also think of people who, are just buying a cabin or lake home in their 30s or 40s, and then as well as, 70s and 80s getting retirement home.
But it's just absolutely critical you define who is going to buy your product, because if you define it too broadly, you really miss the opportunity and you diffuse your efforts, and you maybe don't have enough money to do the broader market. And you spend a lot of time and energy on things that are, let me call it activity, but not fruitful leads. They really don't help you sell and grow the business. If you define it too broadly, you run into that. But if you define it too narrowly, you likely will miss opportunity. So there's really a fine balance in how you do that. So how do you decide on market size? So the number of actual potential buyers that will buy within your market. So you were talking about a landscaping business, right? What is the size of your market? How do you determine that?
So the service area that we cover is the Southeast Metro market, so property managers, homeowners, and commercial businesses in the Southeast Metro market.
Okay, so those are all very different, right? So what is your primary focus, and do you know how many of each of those there are?
I do not know how many regionals there are. I'm trying to figure that out.
Because, I mean,
Not really.
you know, I would think there's a pretty defined market of commercial property people, right? I mean, you probably get a list of that. Number of homeowners is probably quite large, but they're all very different markets with different needs. So you really have to determine how big is that, is it worth going after, and how many, because ultimately, as the next slide shows, what are the actual number of buyers. Now the example I'm going to walk through, and this is just for ease of conversation, but I'm going to define in this example the market size as being St. John's State Med students. Okay, because you all understand that it's an easy market to talk about. But would you believe me if I said that market size is 4,000? Yeah, because that's the enrollment, right, between two schools in round numbers. So, you know, that's a very believable market size. Okay, so if you were determining what is your actual number of buyers on this campus, it's obviously going to depend on how many people are going to buy your product, you know, in this example. And so what I've done in this example, just to give you an illustration, is that I've assumed that in the first year, 1 out of every 4 students is going to buy my widget, you know, that I'm going to make. And then in the second year, it's going to go up to 50%. But I'm not going to go to 100% because there's no way I'm ever going to get 4,000 students to buy whatever I'm selling. And that's just, to me, that's not plausible. You got to say, is that really realistic that you're going to get 100% of a market? Probably not. But is it realistic to say this business is going to grow over time? It's going to take some time to get there. So, you know, the first year, can I get 25%? And can I build that to 50%? Is that realistic or not? And that's why when I talked about periods, maybe then when you get into this first year, you want to do that by month, because maybe you're going to get just 10 students the first month, and then 20, and you're going to build up to 1,000 over a period of 12 months. You know, that would certainly in your apparel business, if you're selling on campus, you aren't going to get all the way to 1,000 students probably on the first day of the first month. And that's probably totally unrealistic. So that's why you've got to build that first year model by month, and we go through the same exercise. But if you buy this example, that would mean you'd have 1,000 buyers the first year and 2,000 the second.
The thing, and do you mind if I jump in? I think the thing that you just said, Greg, that I think is really kind of important to think about is that, and this obviously is a great example of assumption, but the way that Greg articulated kind of thinking about the story is it, you know, you put it in numbers 4,000, 25%, 1,000, that seems realistic, but then converting it to 1 out of 4 students.
Yeah, that's why I said earlier, you go back and forth on the assumptions. You determine the market size, you make some assumptions, and then you go back and you test the assumptions. You say, is that really, really reasonable or not? Because if you miss on this number, and you've hired a whole bunch of people or invested in equipment, you might not be able to ultimately cover your cost, or you might need more capital to get you to that point. It may be worth the effort, but it may take more cash, more time. Thus the reason for the focus on cash on the earlier slides. So ultimately, you know, to prepare this operating statement, we also have to have sales assumptions, and we just talked about market assumptions. But the sales assumptions are, how many units are you going to sell these 1,000 or 2,000 people, and at what price? And so this whole thing is just very vertical in its design. So you start out with what's the market size, how many you're going to buy, and then ultimately how many units are they going to buy and the price, and you work your way down so you can actually then calculate your sales number. And then from that, then you can do the cost is the next piece. So, I'm trying to think who else, I don't know if, trying to think which one of you have a good, how many units are you going to sell in your business? You want to try?
In our apparel business?
Yeah.
We just did our first test, and we purchased 100 shirts at homecoming weekend, and we probably sold 60.
Okay, and how did that match what you projected or expected?
That's pretty much, we only had to sell 50 to break even, so we thought we'd break about even, but we're gonna try to sell them. We didn't tailor them exactly to homecoming. You could still sell them at other events, so we're gonna try like going around the dorms and selling them, just trying to spread it like that.
Okay. So how do you, on the agriculture side, how do you address that?
Good question. I'm trying to determine that.
But I think that'd be really hard. I mean, the apparel's easy, right? Maybe the grilled cheese or, landscaping, but you've got a much harder challenge. Yeah, I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, I just think your hurdle here is a lot more difficult. But if you want a good business plan, you've got to define that. But I, going around with the examples, I would think that is, maybe one of the more difficult models here that we have. So it's not only the number of units that are going to be sold, but how frequently are they going to purchase? So in the t-shirts, is it a one purchase and then are they going to buy a second, right? Or the apparel. In the landscaping business, is it a monthly recurring thing? Where you go back and mow their lawn every month or every week? I mean, how often do they purchase? Or snow shoveling or snow removal is going to be out of your control, right? In your example, you're probably one purchase, and maybe ultimately, if you run this for a long time, maybe there's a second, right? So it's not only how many units are going to be sold, but then how frequently will you do that? And then you have to determine an average selling price. So what I assumed in this example is that in the first period, those buyers are going to buy 1 unit, and in the second year, they're going to buy 2 units each, in the third 3 units. And I know that's realistic, it depends on what you're selling, but you can see you get very different numbers. And if you made an error in the actual number of buyers, that's got a multiplying effect coming down.
So when you're making these assumptions, do you usually feel like you need to be pretty conservative? Because, say you're not, and like you said before, you don't want to get stuck and not meeting costs and having to gain more capital or whatnot. So you usually try to be pretty conservative with the assumptions?
Well, it depends. I heard a story yesterday, and this kind of ties back to your question. And there was a farmer, and his cow got loose on the road, passerby saw the cow and stopped, asked the farmer how much it was worth. The farmer said, "Are you the tax assessor? Did you hit the cow, or do you want to buy the cow? Because if you're the tax assessor, it's not going to be worth very much. If you want to buy the cow, it's going to be worth a lot. If you killed it, I need reimbursement." Okay, so I tell you that story because when you put these plans together, it's who's your audience, and you like to be conservative because the more conservative you are, hopefully that you can meet or exceed those expectations, and you aren't going to get burnt by any way by being short of cash or not making the right investment. But on the other hand, go back to the very early slide. If you're pitching to investors, they want a return on that investment, and you want those numbers to be, you want to really, I don't want to say tease them, but you want them to be passionate, want them to invest and to be excited about it. So what we typically do, or I've done, is you go through various models, and you do a conservative one, an aggressive one, and you work in between. And what you end up with, the one you probably go with is the realistic one, in the middle, or wherever you are in the risk tolerance. But that's why this becomes very tricky, because you are constantly doing and redoing models and doing and redoing assumptions. And I'll tell you, everyone that you think is conservative never is conservative.
So as kind of a follow-up to that, when you just traveled around and did your 80 pitches, do you use the same projections for every pitch you do, or do you tailor it based on who you're actually presenting to?
Well, we've taken the position that we will not give projections.
Okay.
We will, and what we do is we talk about the business, we talk about the market size, the number of buyers, the geographies, the product sets, the different customers, and then let them do their own modeling. And part of the reason I do that is that I'm not accountable for it, because there's liability in the position that I'm in, and I don't want to ever oversell, but I've also got an obligation to enhance value and to, increase the share price, so. We never get projections. A lot of companies do get projections, we don't, and that's the reason. I've been on both sides of the model, and this is a lot better. So, we don't get projections.
So
External. We've got a lot internal.
You talked earlier about like really focusing on your market and understanding it. And you asked Josh about like the different customer segments that he services, like how many are in each. How would you go about discovering that? I mean, for Lauren and I, it's figuring out like how many parents own cabins, how many older generations that like retired up there, and then also like students or young teenagers who are using it. I mean, how would you gather that information? Is there like a census or like a realtor, or I guess?
Well, I mean, I think talking to realtors would be, that's market intelligence. How many do you turn over? How many do you turn over in good economic times? How many sell in an average year in bad economic times? Because your model, you're going to be tied to the economy, right? If people feel more wealthy, they'll buy. If they feel poor, they won't buy. Right. Mortgage rates are down, they'll buy. If it's high, they probably won't. So, you probably have to, also look at some history, look at the ups and the downs, because you probably want to model for, go back to the question earlier, more conservatively, because you don't want to be overly aggressive in saying, we're going to sell X number of units a year because, maybe the mortgage rates are going to go up.
Right.
It's not going to happen. But I don't know how you're going to generate. You go back to, you determine the market size, but how do you generate revenues? And that's where we're getting into these selling assumptions. Is it number of hits? Is it a fee for service? Is it when they transact?
We're selling apparel as well as online advertisements through local businesses.
But then you've got two completely different markets, right? So you've got to go through this exercise in two very different ways. But that's why this is so important, because what's going to cause a buyer to buy, and then how many, and how are you going to, why are they going to pay you? What's your, and I know this goes back to the coursework, but what's the value proposition? Why should somebody buy from you? So it's not only how big the market, but why should they buy? Why will they buy? And how often will they buy? Why will they pay you? And I don't. We'd have to get into a long debate, an hour's worth of discussion to figure out,
right.
How you're going to generate that money. Because then it gets down to, and this is really the question you just asked, or we're debating here, is how much are they going to pay you for what? So what's the average sales price? Now on the apparel side, you're selling apparel, that's much different than if you're doing it based on number of consultations or number of transactions. If you're doing it on a transaction basis, you probably should get paid a lot more than if you're doing it on just an investigative or consulting basis. So what I assumed here in this example is that the unit price is $10, just for an example. And if that's the case, then the first year we have 10,000, second year we have 40, and then 60,000. I mean, that'd be pretty nice to have a $60,000 business, right, by the third year, if you're selling T-shirts or whatever. But it really is dependent on, any one of these assumptions could throw you off, and throw you off quite dramatically, and that's why you got to spend the time going through just all the work and circle back and keep testing, retesting until you're really comfortable with that model.
Greg, I'm wondering if, for the benefit of Andrew and Emily, both of them are working on social ventures, that probably their most important target segment is funding, helping find a key partner that would support them, getting them to where they need, much of which are key resources, much of it's money. How might you convert those kind of assumptions using that kind of need?
That kind of model is really, you're relying on outside funding, maybe like grant funding, or or it could be commercial, or it could be individuals, or however you're going to fund this. So like who you're selling to, you're delivering a value proposition that's pulling at the heartstrings, if you will, or it's the mission of the granting organization or the individuals or the corporations that are funding. And in that case, who are you going to target? Who would have a passion for the business you're in? So if you're going into Africa, you know, who has the passion for Africa? You know, what organizations would it? There's probably a defined list of agencies or foundations, or maybe there's cultural organizations or church organizations that have that as a mission. And that takes a lot of study to go through, but you almost have to, I would think, define the market as who are your donors going to be. And that's no different than a university. I mean, St. John's and St. Ben's. Is it corporate foundations? Is it individuals? Is it corporations? You know, what is it? And there's different targets and different market sizes. But then you target who you're going to go after. But there's probably a defined number. It's not infinite. But you've got to do that because if you're going after a grant funding or social funding, you want to make sure your efforts are going to getting that money. And it's really no different than this. It's how you market. So it's just a different definition of market. And that's why the very first step is how do you define the market? But this is really a lot of work. And I think, I mean, the reason I asked you about talking about it is it's really the crux. If you do a good job on this, your whole business plan will be much stronger, and all these financial statements and so forth that tie together. Now, I've got two examples. Would you like to look at the follies of some of your predecessors? And Terry, you're laughing because when we went through this originally, I looked at, I got to remember, these numbers are close. I looked at 13 business plans in the first 2 years. It was 2 or 3 years earlier.
Yep.
It's 13 plans I looked at. And I tried to decipher from the plans what their market size was and what their sales were going to be. Of the 13, how many do you think I was able to do that with? How many had enough information that I could put together this model that we just went through?
0.
13.
There were 9 that had enough information that I could at least model it. They had enough information that I could model it. Of the 9, how many do you think made sense?
3.
4.
1 out of, so that's 1 out of 13. And that's why I thought this was so important. So I've got 2 examples here that will maybe pull this together. And these are real life examples, and they deal with 2 things, or a couple things that we've talked about. So this is apparel, okay? This was called on-campus screen printing. I don't know if you have you looked at that model? Any of you that are apparel?
No, it's now called T-Spot.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so if you went through their business plan, they identified the market as all St. John, St. Ben students, okay? Is that believable or not believable? You're selling t-shirts. What? No. Okay? They said that the market size was 13,000 t-shirts. Okay? Now, how did you think they got to that
It's like
number?
3 t-shirts per person, 3.5 t-shirts per person.
Everybody buys 30.
Well, I mean, this is where you start getting circular, but what they did, here's what they did. They went through and they said, how many intramural clubs are there that buy t-shirts? How many social service groups are there that sell t-shirts in a year? And they did a lot of work. I think that's how they did this. They went around and found out that in the total year, on the 2 campuses, there were 13,000 t-shirts that were sold for various purposes. And that's how they determined their market size. So in the business plan, they had 13,000. But if there were 13,000 sold, they said that they're going to sell all 13,000 in the given year. Now, do you think that's realistic that they were going to get so in essence, they were saying they were going to replace every t-shirt sale that was made on campus. Realistic or not realistic? Not? Why do you say that?
Because they might not be the cheapest at first year.
Say that, do you think it is all price related?
For students, it's often.
Quality too. I mean, they don't know how to make shirts, and they're gonna make shirts for clubs. So.
Okay. politics involved, that somebody's uncle sells t-shirts. I mean, you know. But then the next thing, the frequency of purchase, right? This is the same exercise, which is they basically assume that everybody's going to buy one t-shirt. Or I mean, these 13 weren't going to be recurring. And then the average selling price was $5, and so they had a $65,000 a year business. So do you think the $5 is a reasonable t-shirt price? You guys are in business? Yeah.
It's
cheap.
It's cheap.
But go back to your point then also. If the market size is 13,000, that's what you sell. But the market is really 4,000 students. Is every student going to buy 3 t-shirts a year? All 100% of them? You don't think so? Well, why don't you think that's reasonable?
So I wouldn't do it. I don't know, it's like a person, like, I don't know, I just think if you're involved in the same club over and over again, if you just have, I don't know, just like buying t-shirts, I don't know, especially if their model isn't set up for growth either. So.
Yeah. But it's interesting, this was the business plan. And so I took the business plan and I calculated out relative to this model. And it really kind of doesn't make sense, does it? That's why you have to circle back and then redo the plan. I'll tell you what the other flaw that I saw in this. Take this first year. Do you think on the first day they're going to sell the first month, take the first month, that they're going to sell 1,000 t-shirts in the first month? There's a cycle also to the school year, right? There's certain times when you might sell for intramurals or for football games or whatever the case might be. So you really have to break this first period down, going back to the periods, and that's what I talked about, and income loss, and maybe events. But isn't this interesting to go through this exercise in real life? Because if you go through and determine market size and go through the exercise we just talked through, this is the calculation you come up with, and then you can go back and say, does this really make sense? All right, this is more in line with your food, midnight munchies. You look at that. Okay, here's what the concept was. The concept was that they were going to have basically a little food cart, right, down by the bus stop at St. John's at midnight, for when kids came off the bus and were hungry, we were going to serve them food because they were going to eat. Okay? That was the concept. So their identified market, again, was St. John's, St. Ben students, 4,000. No assumed assumptions and enrollment and so forth. That 1 out of 5 students were going to buy here, so 20%. That was going to go to 1 out of 4, then basically 1 out of 3, in the third year. That you're going to buy twice a semester. Okay. So every student twice a semester would buy. So they're going to sell 3,200 units of food at $5 each. That was the business. So what's your reaction to that?
Probably should have looked at who's actually getting on and getting off the bus on like weekend nights or something. Because that is reported. So like, I think it'd be hard to estimate 800 people unless they knew that 800 people was not on.
Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, you're in the business, right?
All CSBSU students are not in the market because some people don't go out on nights and weekends. Also, in that decrease in size of the market, the number of actual buyers seems pretty high. 1 in 5 people getting out, which means that the bus carries 70 people. I mean, you can have 20 people lined out for your food cart every 15 minutes. And then it's interesting that they say twice per semester out of one out of every 5 people is going to purchase twice a semester. Seems like they should have less people purchasing, but they'll be purchasing more. If you want repeat customers, that's your goal when you're serving food. But then that you sell more than one, something like a t-shirt. And then their increases seem a little unusual, but it's just because I've been working on my numbers, which I've got from theirs.
Well, first thing I question is the market size really 4,000? Maybe that goes back to your point. I mean, if the food cart is here, is the number really 2,000, right? The people on this campus, because you're on both campuses, right? So, but you get into all the issues that you've talked about. I'd like to expand this a little further because there's ways to test the reasonableness of the assumptions. It's like the example you gave on the t-shirts. That's everyone's gonna buy 3 or 4 a year, right? 3.5 a year. It didn't quite make sense to you. So here's what I did. If you make the assumption, this is how I tested the assumption, that there's 3 weekend selling days, that you aren't gonna have that cart out there on Monday and Tuesday, right? Because there's probably not a lot of activity at midnight. But you're gonna do it Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays. So that was my assumption on how I'm gonna test the reasonableness. And then I said there's 15 weekends in a semester. And I just said 5 in September, 4 in October, 3 in November because of Thanksgiving, 3 in December because of Christmas. So you got 15 weekends. Times 3 is 45, and then times 2 semester, that's how I got to the 90. You probably should have another line in there. Is that a realistic test, you think? Number of selling days? Now what about long weekend? Is that gonna cut into this? Does weather impact this at all? I mean, do you think there's gonna be a couple of rainy days or where people aren't gonna stand outside and buy? So this might be an aggressive number of selling days in a semester. I'm just saying, you go back and, I'm trying to test the reasonableness, but yet even my test is, am I doing the right test or not? So then I made the assumption that if you sold pop at 150, hot dogs and chips, I made up those prices, okay? Because I thought those were reasonable prices. You'd have to sell this many units to get to $16,000. And is that realistic? So that means you'd have to sell 40 every single day, 40 glasses of pop, okay, or cans of pop, whatever you're selling. You'd have to sell 21 hot dogs every day for 90 days. You'd have to sell 11 bags of chips or candy and 32 pieces of pizza every single day of those 90 days to hit the number that they had on the prior page. Realistic, not realistic? How do you say no? Why do you say that? You're the expert now, right?
Well, the past sales of the business that I'm in right now is 135 sandwiches per weekend. So, or excuse me, 90 or 80, between 80 and 80 sandwiches on a Thursday, 135 on a Friday, and 110 on a Saturday. So, I don't know, it seems a little bit different because I only have one product, but interesting.
But then if you just, like if they just sold hot dogs, those would be similar numbers, right?
Well, it depends because there's not too competitive. There's not too competitive products, just like hot dogs and pizza.
Yeah, that's a real good way to look at that.
If you're gonna buy a hot dog, you're probably not gonna buy a pizza and a slice, but you might buy a pop. Maybe buy chips and candy. Maybe you're just in there for a little snack. So I really, I don't know. It's difficult to decide whether or not this is feasible. It looks a little bit now.
It didn't look very feasible to me because this was my test, and I'll go back to the slide. I mean, this is, so I had market size assumptions that you question, frequency of buying we question. I mean, this model, if you go back and redo it to try to get it, I bet it's not a $16,000 business. And that's not to say it's not a good business model. It means you just have to work it more to really understand so you can go after the right market, so you can price it properly, so you can market it properly, and have the right cost structure so you can live with the cost structure. This is not easy stuff to do. I mean, it's really hard and it's agonizing because you get done and then it doesn't make sense and you gotta go back. And it's true in any business. I mean, you asked the question earlier how we model and we've got models like you can't believe with, looking at this whole matrix geographically, when country things make sense and they line it up by product, and you go back and forth, and you still don't know. It's still different at the end than what it really is. So this is, when I talk about operating statement, let me just go through a couple examples. I mean, we have 10, 15 minutes left, or all these classes run. Oh, really, half hour, oh, good. Let's try that.
It's a longer class than before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was worried about having too much material. Do you find this interesting or not interesting?
Yeah.
I mean, is it helpful in putting a class together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to take you through though and show you a little model and how you can mechanically do this too, because not all of you are accounting majors or mathematics majors. So maybe this will be helpful. When we talk about operating statement, it's really the profit and loss statement. These numbers are just here for examples. But what we talked about should get you to this top line, right? And then there's a cost to sell the product. And you may or may not have this. I mean, the t-shirt business, you probably have a cost to buying the raw t-shirt, to printing it, right? There's a cost to do that. So that's your cost of sales. In some business like your landscaping business, you maybe have some shovels and you maybe don't even do this. Maybe you just have wages and equipment or whatever. You know, so this is maybe more traditional manufacturing business. But
Josh is adding, kind of thinking about a fertilizer dimension to his portfolio, so now he's getting into the.
yeah. I had a client when I first started in public accounting, it was Margaret Simmons, and it's one of the big 4 firms, and I was partner for 9 years. So, but I had a customer client that always ran his business based off the gross margin line. And his whole life said, it doesn't matter what you sell, it's how much you make on those sales. That matters. And why did he say that? Why do you think he said that?
Made each sale more effective.
Yeah. You want to make sure you get the most for each sale. Well, his whole theory was, this number here is the most important number because that's what pays the wages, allows you to run the business. Now, I could challenge him and say, maybe this is the most important number, how much you earn. It's not how much you sell, but how much you earn, because this is what allows you to run the business. Now, you could go even further and go back to the first slide. It's not how much you earn on the bottom line, but it's how much cash you generate, because the cash you generate is what you can reinvest in the business, to grow the business, to buy more equipment, to hire more people, to give a return to your investors. So think back to that very first slide. It's not how much you sell, but you want this number ultimately to be higher than the top line. You want the bottom line growing faster than the top line. You want to make sure you got enough cash coming out of this, and that's growing at a rate faster than this. And that doesn't always happen in the first year. And you might be willing to invest some time until the business grows to the point of profitability, but you have to understand. So we spent a lot of time on sales. I think, we'll go through examples on wages and stuff, but I think you can probably figure out what your costs are, and then you get down to net income. But that's your operating statement. But it all derives, again, from what assumptions you're going to make, and especially these sales making assumptions. Because the more you sell, the more people you're going to need. The more you sell, perhaps the more equipment or supplies or whatever you're going to need. So then you move to the balance sheet. And there's something called working capital, and that's what you need just to run the business. So when you sell, in the business, selling t-shirts and selling food, you get the money right away. In the business you're talking about, it's going to be highly dependent. You might have a lot of costs, but you might need capital. You need cash. You need cash to run the business, so you need to get grant money or funding earlier on so you can run the business for a period of time. You've got certain working capital needs. And working capital is what you need to work the business, how much cash you need to work the business. Now, if you're in, I don't know if you're going to extend credit or not, but let people pay their bills every month in your landscaping business, but you'll be expending time and energy paying wages, but you're going to have accounts receivable. They're going to be out there that you're not going to get the cash right away. Now, you're going to have inventory, right? You're going to have to buy buns and meat and whatever for your business. You're gonna have to buy t-shirts. So you gotta invest money in inventory, so are you gonna really recover that? How much do you need, how much cash do you need to run that business? And then are you gonna pay your vendors? Are you gonna pay your employees every day, every week? When are you gonna pay for the raw materials for the t-shirts or the vendors for the food, or whatever? So then you have to go through and figure out how much equipment you need. You know, is it rakes, shovels, tractors, printing? Are you going to print? You can outsource. And then when you get all done with this, you're going to need some cash to run the business. You're really going to need cash to run the business. So how much do you need? And are you going to put that in? Or are you going to borrow it? Or are you going to get some investor to put the money in? So is the cash equity debt, or you know, or is it from the operations of the businesses? And if you have equipment, are you going to buy versus leasing it? Buying obviously takes much more cash than if you lease and you're renting. So these are all assumptions you've got to go through. And again, we'll come back and I'll show you an example of assumptions and how I look at that. But if you make good assumptions on a balance sheet, you should be able to calculate a balance sheet pretty easily. So, and has anybody gotten involved in balance sheets before? And how did you handle that? And how did you?
Well, I guess the first time I ever saw a balance sheet, it was like just right in front of me instead of me trying to start figuring out what's really going on in the business. And I was like 17 years old and I didn't understand it at all. Just sort of figured it out and I had a point and really tried to realize what areas needed to improve to make everything look better.
Well, yes, I think balance sheets are a little bit foreign to most people. And so I'll walk through an example a little later on how to calculate one. Do you have any perspectives from the accounting student?
Well, just, I mean, working with them in everyday class, or I guess I've never been involved in really throwing them together, but just like in internships and whatnot, just being able to know what numbers to pull from. I mean, there's definitely outside of the major so far, you never hear a whole lot about what's your debt to asset ratio or whatever, but that's pretty important when it comes to business.
I think the issue you're faced with in putting a business plan together, and you go back to when I had the 4 bubbles on the chart, you really need to understand how much cash, how much investment you need in the business and what you need that for, and how you're going to recover those assets. Those assets, investment in inventory, receivables, how are you going to get money back? The quicker you can turn that and turn those assets into cash, the stronger the business will be, and that's why the emphasis on cash. But you need to construct a balance sheet because I know the operations are easy to analyze, the operating statement. You know, we've talked a lot about that. I think that's probably the easiest of the statements to pull together. But when I look at a business, I look at the balance sheet because the question you get to is how quickly can you turn the assets into cash? And then what are the risks or the liabilities? Who do you owe money to? And then what's the risk? I mean, what's the asset risk? So on a receivable, what's the risk of somebody not paying? What's the risk of the equipment becoming obsolete? You know, so if you do a good job on the balance sheet, then you can really understand where the risk is in the business.
Greg, can you speak to the balance sheet as it relates to kind of service business or businesses that might have more of an intangible product where you don't physically, like we have a couple that are developing an app, Long's developing his app as it relates to St. Vincent, St. John's, we have a like website development. You know, how would those things that you don't have physically here, but how does that get reflected on a balance sheet?
Well, I mean, you're really investing you've got a lot of cost up front, right? And that cost is your time, right? Your time and your wages, and, you know, maybe some computer equipment, right? But that takes time. It takes a certain amount of cash, and what you're trying to figure out is how much cash do you need to develop this app or this software, how much computer equipment you need. And, you know, what you're really trying to do is how much are you willing to invest, because that's an asset. That time is an asset, that equipment is an asset. And whether you record it on the balance sheet or not as an asset, you want some return on that. But it's really kind of a sunk cost. I mean, if I was modeling that business, I don't think I would, going back to an earlier comment, I'd model that pretty conservatively, and I'd say I need these much cost, but I want to capitalize the asset even though it is an asset. And then if I was going out to sell the company at some point, I would say, you know, this is an asset worth so much. But what you're really selling is the future cash generation of that business. So how much are you willing to invest in that business to get what kind of cash later on? And that's why you get into all the selling assumptions. But you probably don't have a balance sheet of any significance in that kind of business. Now, if it's a true service business, like the business you're talking about where you're delivering services, then you're selling time. And you probably do have some receivables, you know, in exchange for that time.
But your advertisers or the cash they need to fund other things, those would be the
Right.
things that you would
So this is what a balance sheet looks like. And so we talk about balance sheet is how much cash do you have, how much receivables, how much inventory, what equipment, and then how are you going to finance this? And in this example, I said that we're going to put $2,000 of our own money in, or somebody will sell stock, and we're going to borrow $1,500 from a bank or from somebody. That's just the assumption to show what a balance sheet looks like. But you've got to fund the business someplace, and that comes either from equity or from debt. And I'll work through how to put this all together. But this is what a balance sheet looks like. This is the end of the period. And then you get to the cash flows. And what cash flows really are is you calculate the changes in the balance sheet, and that's why there's an order. You do the operating statement. From the operating statement comes the balance sheet. From the balance sheet then cash flow statement. And the changes in the balance sheet really are numbers that go directly to the cash flow. And then you can turn around and you've got to reconcile to make sure all the numbers tie out in the 12th step. As you go back and you start the whole process all over again, and you challenge your assumptions, and you do it again and again and again and again. So when I say changes in the balance sheet, let's go through this because there's 6 things that can happen, changes in the balance sheet. You can increase assets, okay? Pick an asset, Mike. What would an asset be?
Computers.
Okay, so that's equipment, right? Does that use, if you increase an asset, if you have more computer equipment, do you use cash or do you get cash?
Use cash.
Right, so that's a use of cash, okay? If you're buying an asset, if you have a receivable outstanding, so if you're owed more at the end of the period than you are at the start, does that use cash? Are you tying up cash or are you getting cash? If receivables increase? Right? You're tying it up, right? You're using cash. You've paid wages or whatever and somebody owes you money. So you really haven't, that sale is not really complete yet. You haven't turned that sale into cash yet. So that receivable increases, you're basically using cash. Okay, what if you take the reverse of that? If that receivable decreases, what happens? You're getting cash, you're increasing cash. You haven't done anything more, right? I mean, you could close the business down today. If that receivable came in tomorrow, you would generate cash, right? You'd get cash. The reverse is true in liabilities. If I've got an accounts payable to a vendor, if that increases, am I getting cash or using cash? You're gaining cash because if my payable goes up, I've gotten something from the vendor that I haven't paid for. I haven't expended cash yet. I haven't paid for it yet. So if your liabilities increase, or let's say you borrow money from the bank, if your bank debt is higher at the end of the period than it was at the start, did you get cash out of that transaction or did you pay cash? You got it, right? So if that liability, if that debt to the bank goes up, you increased your liabilities, you've really gotten more cash, you've generated cash. But if you paid the bank back, if your bank balance is less at the end of the period than at the start, you've really used cash. And so the reason I go through this is a kind of a cheat sheet for you. If you get a good balance sheet, that's all you have to do is line up beginning and end of period and calculate the changes, and that's your change. That's your change in cash. That's how much cash you generated in the period. And so I wanted to go through an example of this and where you get this. So at the beginning of the period, if you started this business, let's say you put $500 in to start this business. That's on day one. You have a business, first day, January 1st of 2013, you put $500 in to start the business. So your only asset is cash, and you've got an investment. At the end of the period, you've done a number of things during 2013. You borrowed $1,500, somebody invested $1,500 more in stock, and then you used that money to buy equipment, you sold some, people owe you money. So this is the balance sheet at the end. And that change is really the source or the use, the generation or the use of cash. And that's how you calculate a cash flow statement. So, I mean, go through each of these, and let's go bottom up. This is the earnings, so you earn $400. Is that if your earnings, is that a source or a use of cash if you earn something? Source, right? Why? Because you earned something, right? If you sold stock, does that increase cash or decrease cash? Okay, because you got cash coming in, right? So these are positive numbers. If you borrowed $2,000 and repaid $500, it's up by $1,500. Did you generate cash or did you use cash?
Well, you have more than you started with.
Right.
So you use 500.
Yeah, so you generated 2, paid back, used 5, now you've got $1,500 more cash. If you owe your vendors $400 more than at the start of the year, that helped. Gave you more cash to use in the business. Now, if you bought equipment, did they use cash? Yeah, so that's negative. You spent, in this example, $2,500 to buy the equipment, and then you depreciated it, but that depreciation really didn't use cash. Yeah, because the $2,500 is what you used. But you go through this example, and so that's your cash flow for the period, and basically cash is $250.
Is there a reason why you have the ending before the beginning?
Well, it's just mathematical, but I wanted to be able to subtract this to this because I thought it tied out better. It's just I thought that'd be an easier example to show because the negatives and positives then in the cash and the changes end up being positive or sources. If I did it the other way, the numbers would be reversed. So I did that for illustration purposes. I thought it was easier to understand. So these numbers just come out from the other one. And so you start with the net income of 4, depreciation you add back. You add back the changes in your working capital, so your operations used $750. You borrowed $2,000, you paid back, and at the end of the year, you ended up with $250 cash, right? That was what was on the balance sheet. We'll hand out these slides so you've got this to refer to, but it's really kind of a simple exercise.
Greg, we have about 10 minutes, so I'm just.
Wait, so this is my cheat sheet that I'm going to leave with you, and they're in the handouts. If I was setting up, now I assume you all have spreadsheet skills. This is how I would set this up. I would set, and I've set this up like an Excel spreadsheet. First year I do by month, second year by quarters, years 3 to 5 I do annually. I'd start with my assumptions, go to my operating statement, my balance sheet, my cash flows. And that's how I would set up this spreadsheet.
Now, preview of coming interactions, we are going to be working on this in the next couple of class periods. We'll be having plotting points to get to building this, and we'll be doing some workshops right within class period to kind of refine and, like our last class period, testing assumptions so that you can kind of see. So just know that we'll be working through some of what Greg's shared with us today.
So what I would start out with, I'm going back to the very start of the example we went through, is, and you can start out with market, and you can do the exercise market size, how many you're going to buy. You can put all that in your spreadsheet. But ultimately you need to come down, how many units are you going to sell, and what's the selling price. But you can just model that just vertically coming down to the point that if you change an assumption, then the whole rest of this will just all calculate. So what I did on here is the black are what are the variables and the things you got input. The blue calculates. So if you have good assumptions on units, you can just plug whatever your assumptions are, your market sizes, however you want to calculate it, your selling prices, you can change them. Your labor, these are your costs. And if you set the spreadsheet up like this, it's very easy just to change assumptions and to go back. So then, so these are wages. So you're going to have a manager and accountant. That's how much you're going to pay. Again, the blue calculates out. These are my other costs. And then you've got to make some balance sheet assumptions. How much are you going to invest in inventory? How long are your receivables going to be outstanding? How long are your payables going to be outstanding? How much equipment do you need? And again, you get very specific on what kinds of equipment. How long is it going to be useful? Because that calculates the depreciation. How much you're going to borrow, how much you're going to repay, what the interest rate is. But you make all your assumptions. And again, the blue calculates, and the assumptions just fold in. So then what you end up with a section, the assumption section. And then from this, you'll see that the operating statement, all these numbers come from one of the prior cells. And the whole operating statement calculates just based on the assumptions you put in to that first section. So that's why I said earlier, you spend all the time working on the assumptions and the rest then can flow out. But just look at all the numbers on here. They're either calculated or they flow from another cell. So you don't really have to spend a lot of time preparing an operating statement if you get your assumptions right. And then the balance sheet, you'll see all this calculates out as well. And comes from other cells. And I put the formulas in on how to calculate that out. And again, we'll hand these out to you afterwards. And then from that comes the cash flow. And then you come right back full circle. So I know that was a lot at the end, but the whole theory is if you spend time getting good assumptions, getting a good analysis of your cost or your sales, your markets, your sales, your cost, you get a good sales number, you can understand the markets, then you get your profitability, and then it just flows down to cash generation, and then you know what your returns on investment are. And it's not very all that complex once you get into it, but the focus needs to be on the market size, and on the assumptions, because if you have good assumptions and sound assumptions, the rest becomes somewhat mechanical, and then you can come back around and analyze it to make sure it really makes sense. Go back to the two examples we have. When you get all done and you go through this exercise, you could tell whether or not that whole thing made sense or not. And then you go back and change the assumption and just keep working circularly until you get a good business plan. And once you get a good business plan, I'll guarantee you it'll change, once you get into the first month of operation. So, hopefully we use the time wisely. There was a lot of material, maybe too much, I don't know. But hopefully it was interesting, hopefully it was helpful. What are the reactions, what are the questions?
You use this simple idea, or whatever, I don't want to take what you call it, this steps, but it's process in businesses that you create as well.
Yeah. This model, those spreadsheets at the end, when we formed this startup entity that lasted 7 years, I can't tell you, we were doing these almost by the week, but that was the exact model we used. And then, we summarized the data at the end into the business plan to make it presentable. But, I've got just files with that exact model. But every business is different, so you've got to change the assumptions and how you calculate those assumptions. But the P&L, the balance sheet, and so forth are all the same. And in the business I'm in now, basically do the same thing. But we do it by geography, and then the assumptions are by product type and by customer type. So the market size is based on geography, it's based on customer, it's based on, and then we calculate out units, and then we look, does it make sense? What do the growth rates make sense? But yes, that's a long answer, but yes. Carrie?
So would you go back and just talk through the guys that said, we bought 100 shirts and we thought we were gonna sell, and we sold 60, sort of help them think about what was the assumption and it gets down to that little level. What is your assumption? And how do you then change it now after you've had the experience?
So how did you define the market?
Just like students and alums on St. John's campus during homecoming.
So do you
That was
assume-
our first, that'd be our
So you
first
assume there's gonna be
semester.
15,000 people roaming around campus, or?
I guess we assumed, yeah, probably 50,000 people roaming around.
And you thought you'd sell